So, anyway, with that, I'm going to turn it over to my esteemed colleague in the docent for this November 2018 tour, Phil Sexton.
Well, good morning, everybody. I'm thrilled to be here, but I have to tell you that as a non-Chinese person, it intimidates the heck out of me to talk about Chinese culture and heritage. So please be patient, and I try to listen carefully to what I do. But my, I guess, main connection with this is that I probably know the physicalities of the Donner Pass area as well as anybody. I had the good fortune to live up there for 13 years. And during that time, I ran interpretive programs where I walked all over the pass, both with groups and on my own. And that's part of the reason I came to the California State Railroad Museum. They valued my knowledge about that, and they doubled my salary. So that was an important consideration doing that. But during the time I was at the Railroad Museum, I also regularly took up groups of new employees and docents up to the pass. I developed a partnership with the UC Davis History Project Office, which does teacher education. And one of their key projects every year is to do a 2-week program called Teaching the Transcontinental Railroad. So I had a good fortune to take educators up there and spend a day walking the pass with them and Sierra Club groups and oh gosh, I don't know what else. That led to connections with the Stanford University Chinese Railroad Workers Project, which got me involved with them, and a whole bunch of other things. But part of that is I somehow made the connection with the 1882 Foundation and Ted and John and others to lead this tour last year. And like a lot of tours, it didn't exactly quite go according to the plan, but that was actually an advantage for us because we were scheduled to do a bus trip over the pass from basically Sacramento on over to Reno and then come back onto the train. And the train was 6 hours late, so we came back on the bus and stopped and looked at sites that we didn't have time to look at on the way over, which was wonderful. But the Donner Pass area is the penultimate achievement of building the Transcontinental Railroad. And it's also easily accessible during the summer, and it is a touchstone because of the physical nature of the resources. But even beyond the Chinese experience, any pass is sort of like a funnel. Things cross over pass because it concentrates an area where you can cross over. So the history of the pass actually predates modern humans, going back hundreds of thousands of years as a place where wildlife and air currents and pollen and all sorts of things cross the pass. The earliest human connection there is anywhere from about 2,500 to about 4,000 years before present, and that's physically extant there in the presence of what are called Martis-era petroglyphs. And if you look at the photo on the left there, that's the group looking at this petroglyph site, which is still there. When I still work for the Forest Service, we put an interpretive sign there, and if you have a background in cultural resources with a federal agency, you know that you never point out where petroglyphs are. They're actually hidden on a separate GIS layer so that even most employees can't see them. But in this case, the petroglyphs are so well known, and that started during the construction period because the petroglyph panel is actually in between the construction site and one of the barracks sites, so the Chinese workers were certainly aware of them. And we worked with the Washoe tribe to put up a sign there to try and encourage respectful use and acknowledgement of the petroglyphs to kind of reduce their damage. But there is this incredible prehistoric history of the pass, and then in the early 19th century, starting at about 1830, you start to have explorers coming over from the then very young country of the United States westward to explore California, kind of as a pretext for seizing it from the Spanish and Mexican governments. So people like John C. Fremont explored over the pass. Early trappers in the 1830s were known to cross the pass. But nobody really left a trace. And then in 1844, 2 years before the Donner Party, the first group of immigrants crosses this pass with covered wagons, and they become the very first people. That was called the Stevens, Townsend, Murphy Party. And I have a little bit of a personal connection with them, so they've always resonated very closely with me. But That leads to the very first immigrant trail to California overland for covered wagons. Donner Pass is the first. And people who really pay attention to the history and understand the significance of the Stevens story tried in the 1970s to rename Donner Pass Stevens Pass. And if you think about that, that actually makes a lot of sense. There's even a little small plaque hidden up there at the pass that names it Stevens Pass, put up in the middle of the night by E. Clantus Vitus. It is kind of a misnomer to call it Donner Pass because the Donner Party never successfully crossed it. It would be like studying football and concentrating on O.J. Simpson. It's just not quite right in that sense. But it became the first pass to California. It was not the most heavily used pass, though. Actually, the Echo Summit crossing that goes from Nevada into the Placerville area south of Lake Tahoe was the most popular and heavily used crossing. But about 40,000 people that we believe used Donner Pass during the gold rush period, and there is still a little bit of evidence, not quite at the pass, but close by of this. There's also a more heavily used pass within sight of that called Gold Stream Pass that is all connected to history. I mention this because this led to Theodore Judah finding the pass and deciding that this was the one for the railroad. People had talked about building a railroad to California since railroads came to the United States in the mid-1830s. And starting in the mid-1840s, you start to hear talk about this in Washington and the need to do this. Of course, the gold rush really put this into high gear. California's gold is literally what financed the Union Army during the Civil War. And so California was a big prize for the Union. And in fact, when President Lincoln was first elected, he won California by about 635 or 638 votes. So in the midst of this great triumph, in this great trial of Lincoln's, where there were literally Confederate troops within sight of the White House, he signs the Pacific Railroad Act. It's that important. In the middle of trying to save the country, he signs this act to do this major construction project. Partly as political payback to California, partly because prior to the Civil War, the Congress could not agree on a route to the Pacific Railroad because Southern congressmen did not want a northern route that would help increase the power of free states, and the northern legislators did not want a southern route that might help spread slavery for the West. So you actually have the attack on Fort Sumter to thank for the Pacific Railroad. How history works, isn't it? But the railroad, the immigrant trail is very important. Just ahead of building the railroad, Charlie Crocker, one of the owners of the Central Pacific Railroad, put in a toll road that went from the western slopes to Virginia City and the Comstock Lode area called the Dutch Flat Donner Lake Wagon Road. And that served two purposes. One is it captured traffic from the Comstock Lode. The Comstock Lode hit in 1859. It was the world's largest silver strike. All of that silver had to come west to San Francisco to either be minted at the San Francisco Mint or to be put on ships and sailed around to the U.S. Treasury here on the East Coast. And prior to the existence of the Dutch Flat Road, there was a long circuitous route called the Hennis Pass Road that went to a place a little bit east of Truckee called Hennis Pass, and then northwesterly to the headwaters of the North Yuba River, and then down North Yuba, and down to a point near Nevada City, and crossing a wooden bridge, and then on and on and on. So the Dutch Flat Road actually was the hypotenuse of a triangle, and it cut the travel time by over a day and made it very efficient and very profitable for Charlie Crocker and his cronies. But this also allowed the railroad as it was being built to supply men and materials ahead of the end of track. So this all ties in. The railroad gets completed, of course, but Donner Pass is important, still continues, because the former Dutch Flat Donner Lake Wagon Road becomes the first route of the Lincoln Highway. The Lincoln Highway was the first route for automobiles to cross the United States. This is really important for my family history because it was my grandparents who came from Iowa to California on the Lincoln Highway in 1923 with my mother as a 4-year-old. That, of course, led to the creation of US 40, which is called the Old Road today, and it shows a little bit in the left-hand photo there in the background behind the petroglyphs. That's what makes this area, one of the things that makes the area so interesting is you can easily access it and get to it on foot from that road. But let me get back to the Lincoln Highway for a second, because in 1917, Lieutenant Dwight D. Eisenhower was a truck driver on the first military convoy across the United States as proof of concept to see if the military could actually use trucks and roads to move themselves. He hated that trip. It was an awful trip. And it was Eisenhower in the 1950s who signed the Interstate Highway Act. And I think that there's a connection there. He doesn't write about that, and a lot of historians say that the Interstate Highway Act signed by Eisenhower was based on his observations of the Autobahns in Germany, but I think it was a combination of the two. Interstate 80 today does not go over Donner Pass. It goes about 2 miles north of that at a place called Ewer Saddle, but it's easily accessible to there. So today you have this place that is really crucial to the Americanization of California. It's a place where the first immigrants came across. It's a place where thousands of gold seekers entered the state hoping to make their fortunes. It's a place that still connects California with the rest of the United States. Even if Interstate 80 is just a little bit off, it's close there. And through this pass also today, in addition to the old road and the railroad, there is a major oil pipeline that serves northern Nevada. There is an internet backbone. And buried in the trenches of Donner Pass somewhere is a single-line copper telephone line that we learned a few years ago was President Roosevelt's secret direct telephone line to the Presidio, built during World War II. And so this is an incredible resource, not just for the Chinese history, but for this whole history of how important this pass is that connects this island of California, which is what it was when there were no other states west of the Mississippi River, to the rest of the United States. And I'm just real pleased to have spent many years up there. I hope it's been many years up there walking around and showing people the great resources. Does that cover it, John?
How about talking about
The railroad? They built a railroad? The railroad,
years ago.
the railroad was of course, built through there in the 1860s, and they worked in Donner Pass area from about 1865 to 1867. One of the reasons that this is so significant for the history of the railroad and the history of the Chinese is that as the railroad moved forward, they put up tents, they built, then they moved the tents, and then they moved the tents. But here, they didn't move things for about 2 years, so they actually built structures, and they went through some of the most horrendous winters on record. You read accounts that are somewhat hyperbolic, but you read accounts of 60-foot deep snowdrifts, and I can see that. I lived up there for a long time, and remember, snowdrifts are snow where snow piles up, it's not what falls. So if you have 6 feet of snow, you can easily have a 20 or 30-foot snowdrift. This past winter, by the way, according to the people that track snow, was the 5th heaviest winter since 1870 when official records have been kept. And it's wonderful, but I don't know what's going to happen at the end of June when I have tours scheduled with UC Davis. But the railroad challenge of doing this was that the people who built the railroad, who we refer to as the Big Four today, were not railroad builders. Experienced people who built railroads said that this was impossible. And thank goodness that Stanford and Huntington and Crocker and Hopkins didn't know it was impossible, so they did it anyway. The reason the Chinese were involved was there was a huge labor shortage in California when the project started in 1863 in the midst of the Civil War. 2 reasons. One was that a lot of California men went back to fight as part of the California Regiment in the Civil War. But the other one was that there was a silver strike in Nevada, in the Comstock War. And that was much more profitable than working for the railroad. And although it was a horrible working condition, you were in mines that were on thermal areas and they heated up as you dug into the ground. You were still guaranteed a good wage, and it was actually safer than working for the railroad. So in the early days, a lot of white men would sign on to work on the railroad. They would be taken to the end of the track. They would work for a couple days and say, hey, thanks for the ride, see ya. And off they would go to Nevada. And when they reached the town of Auburn, which is where I live now, there was a critical labor shortage. The railroad was stopped almost dead in its tracks. And Mr. Crocker came up with the idea for hiring Chinese. And he went to Mr. Huntington and said, I want to hire Chinese. No, you don't. No, they're too small. They can't do anything. We want to hire Chinese. No, you don't. And the apocryphal story, I think, because I don't know anybody recorded this, said, well, they built the Great Wall. I think they could do this. But this was an easy call for the railroad because Chinese at the time, the 1882 Act, of course, had not been signed, but Chinese at the time, because of the prejudice of the day, could not own businesses, they could not have mining claims, they could not have any substantial assets. They could work as launderers, they could work as cooks, they could work as merchants for herbalists and things in their own community, but there was a huge unemployment rate among Chinese. They couldn't find things to do. And so they hired on eagerly. First 8 Chinese workers at Bloomer Cut. And that proved so successful that by the end of that year, in 1865, over 1,700 Chinese were employed by the Central Pacific Railroad. This grew and grew and grew with attracting Chinese from the Sacramento area, then into the Bay Area, and then hiring labor contractors to go to the Pearl River country and bring back Chinese to work for the railroad. But getting back to Donner Pass, they get up here in 1865 and they have a horrendous job ahead of them because the end of track stops at a place called Cisco, about 8 or 9 miles west of Donner Pass. There are 9 tunnels to complete before you can get to what is today the town of Truckee. And until those tunnels are complete, the railroad is not getting paid by the federal government for completed track because they don't have completed track. So the Chinese are eagerly put to work, and by this time they have acquired skills such as masons and carpenters and expert blasters and all of the really skilled work, not just the unskilled work of grading and laying track. So they are eagerly put to work. There are thousands of Chinese that work on these 9 tunnels, and they're working on them simultaneously. When you read newspaper accounts, and some of the journalists talk about the thousands of workers swarming like ants over the mountains, they are not talking about just the Summit Tunnel. They are talking about this stretch of about 15 miles because people are working simultaneously. And they are blasting tunnels, and before the dust even clears, they are shoveling out the rock and putting it in carts to dump over the hillside to make fills in between the tunnels to fill in the low spots. They are building this magnificent dry-laid 75-foot tall wall that is today called China Wall. And if you go up there, and I hope you can come up there, and I hope I can show you this, the wall is dry-laid. There is no masonry, there is no mortar in it. It is interlocked like a jigsaw puzzle, and from 1868 to 1993, it supported the weight of every locomotive and every car and every passenger that crossed it, and it would still support that load today. But in 1993, Southern Pacific was going broke, and they detracked this section, and they put all the traffic in another more modern tunnel. This gives us the opportunity to explore these areas safely, and it, I think, leads the opportunity to consider this as a monument or some sort of historic designation. But the railroad is completed, and during that time that the tunnels are being built, because the railroad is so eager to make progress, they also use Chinese workers to, in the wintertime, sled an entire locomotive, 40 flat cars, and 40 miles of rail to where the town of Truckee is today and begin laying track eastward down the Truckee River Canyon towards Nevada. So that when those tunnels are completed and when they lay in that track, they will have about 35 miles of completed track, and that's a giant cash infusion from the federal treasury. From then on, it's relatively easy as a mechanical project. It's not nearly as difficult as anything over Donner Pass was, but you have to cope with the Nevada heat and the isolation and the fact that you're way far away from any kind of good resources. So water has to be carried in on flat cars, the food has to be carried in. There are no cities really east of Dutch Flat, and the farther you get out to the desert, the more isolated this is. But crossing Donner Pass suddenly made it possible in people's minds that this railroad would be completed. It also opened up California's agriculture for the rest of the United States and those who live in the East. I've always been a Californian. I've always been spoiled by having fresh vegetables year-round, but in the 19th century, to suddenly have fruit hauled into a very cold place and be able to eat a fresh orange or a fresh apple or something had to be a remarkable thing, and this was not possible. But the development, and this spurred development of agriculture all over the West, which also provided further employment opportunities for Chinese. It also began the exploitation of what today is a national forest land, but because of the proximity of the railroad, you could cut timber, you could set up mills, you could haul lumber to many, many places. In 1906, this became incredibly important after most of San Francisco burned down after the Great San Francisco earthquake, but it spurred development all over the place and led to whole bunch of resource extraction, utilization, and really the modernization of California.